Welcome to the present path, a place where questions cut deeper than answers, where reality unravels, gently, quietly, until nothing feels quite the same. If you've ever doubted what's real, or wondered who you really are, you're in the right place. Take a breath, let go of what you know, and step into the silence beneath the noise. Welcome home. We believe the universe plays by rules. Gravity pulls, time flows forward, light moves at a limit. These laws hold our world together, predictable, sane. But what if those laws begin to crack? What if you discovered that mass can disappear, that light can hold weight, that time can reverse without warning? What if nature isn't following a script, but improvising badly? In this journey, we explore 25 paradoxes, strange, quiet violations of the natural order, not science fiction, not fantasy, but theories that sit just on the edge of what's possible, stretching the seams of physics, reason, and reality itself. These aren't puzzles to solve. They are distortions to feel. Moments where the world turns inside out and invites you to watch. So forget what you know about the universe. Let gravity rise. Let time bend. Let fire freeze and distance vanish. Because once nature stops obeying, so must your mind. Gravity is simple, right? What goes up must come down. The apple falls, the rain descends. The mountain erodes, grain by grain, never the other way around. We live in a world where down is sacred, stable, constant. Gravity anchors reality. It tells us which way is real. But what if you fell upward? Not metaphorically, not spiritually. Physically, your body pulled skyward, your feet leaving the ground, not by force or propulsion, but by surrender. What if gravity reversed, and the thing that held you to the earth began to let go? This is the paradox. A fall is meant to be downward. But what if the fall is up? What if letting go lifts you? It's not as far-fetched as it sounds. In certain pockets of advanced theoretical physics, particularly within speculative models of negative mass or warped space-time, there exist regions where gravitational force could act in ways we would perceive as reversed. Not pushing objects away, but bending space so strangely that falling becomes rising. Where you move in the direction of least resistance, and it just happens to be toward the sky. But that's not the real story. The real story is psychological, because we are all falling through life, through decisions, losses, changes, identity. Crises we associate falling with failure, with collapse, with descent into something worse. But what if the fall is exactly what saves you? What if you don't fall down, but through illusions, through fear, through everything false that kept you standing still? What if the downward spiral you feared was actually a lift-off? Here's how this paradox lives in the real world. You lose your job and feel like you're falling, but you're also shedding the role that was quietly killing you. You fall out of a relationship and discover the self you buried inside it. You hit rock bottom and finally see the sky for the first time. In those moments, you don't rise by climbing. You rise by falling differently. Falling upward, it defies logic. It mocks Newton. But it speaks to something deeper than science, a law of inner nature. Because sometimes, gravity isn't what keeps you grounded, it's what keeps you from flying. We're trained to resist the fall, to cling to stability, to brace ourselves against change. We build our lives like towers, vertical, rigid, sky-seeking. But towers crack. And when they do, the fall feels catastrophic. Unless it's not. Unless the fall is an invitation to shift your orientation, to realize that up and down are perspectives, that rising isn't always vertical, that collapse might be the beginning of ascension, that you're not falling apart, you're falling free. This is how people reinvent themselves, not by control, but by surrender, by allowing the fall to teach them something the climb never could. When you fall upward, you let go of the map, of the narrative, of the idea that progress must always look like ascent. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is lose your footing and trust what catches you. It might not be the earth, it might not be logic, it might not be anything you can name, but it will be real, because reality doesn't always obey our sense of direction. It doesn't reward those who grip tightly. It rewards those who can fall and still keep rising. So ask yourself, what part of your life are you resisting, simply because it feels like falling? What would happen if you leaned into it, not with despair, but with curiosity? What if this collapse is gravity flipping, not to pull you down, but to release you into the sky? It sounds impossible. It feels backward. But so do most awakenings. They arrive like a floor giving way, like everything known unraveling, only to reveal a kind of flight that doesn't need wings. Falling upward isn't safe. It doesn't come with answers, but it comes with truth. And if you're ready to let go, not of everything, but of your resistance to the fall, you might discover that the ground you feared losing was never the ground you needed. So fall, let go, watch what rises, and when it does, don't ask how, just breathe, and keep falling. Fire burns, that's its essence. It consumes, it transforms. It dances in heat and motion, devouring everything it touches. We learn early that fire is alive, wild, fast, chaotic. You don't touch it, you don't reason with it, you respect it, because fire, by its very nature, is untamable. But what if fire could freeze? Not metaphorically, not as a poetic contradiction, but literally. What if something so inherently hot could turn still, cold, quiet, without ever extinguishing? This is the paradox. A flame that burns without heat. A passion that rages without motion. A fire that never dies because it never moves. It sounds like fantasy, but in the world of high energy, physics, and theoretical thermodynamics, there are strange clues. There are exotic states of matter like Bose-Einstein condensates that challenge our understanding of energy, temperature, and flow. There are cold flames in combustion science, where fuel burns invisibly, at temperatures so low it defies our classic model of fire. And then, there's the human experience, because you felt it, that cold fire, that slow, heavy burn that doesn't move wildly, but won't go out either. The ache that lingers long after the heartbreak. The rage that simmers beneath the surface. Controlled, frozen yet very much alive. The desire that doesn't leap, doesn't shout, but endures. We think of passion as loud, explosive, but the deepest passions often arrive like frost. They don't burn fast. They freeze the soul in place, and you can't stop thinking about them. This is where frozen fire becomes a paradox of the heart, because fire is supposed to liberate, to destroy the old, to make space for something new. But what happens when it burns too slowly to be noticed? What happens when you're on fire, but no one sees the smoke? You're suffering, but you're composed. You're breaking down, but you're functioning. From the outside, it looks like calm, but inside, you are burning in place. This is why depression is often mistaken for detachment, why grief wears the mask of numbness, why trauma survivors are praised for being strong, when they've simply frozen their fire to survive. Stillness is not the absence of heat, it's sometimes the very evidence of it. You don't cry, you don't scream, you just hold the flame. Quietly, constantly, like a furnace with no vent, and slowly it changes you, because frozen fire is dangerous in its own way. Not because it consumes quickly, but because it endures indefinitely. It doesn't leave ashes. It leaves ice where warmth used to be. People forget that fire is not just heat, it's transformation. But when it freezes, the transformation stalls. You stay in the moment of pain, in the loop, in the memory, not moving forward, not healing, just burning in silence. So, what's the escape? The answer isn't to extinguish the flame. You can't, you shouldn't. The fire is part of you, your passion, your grief, your capacity to feel. But it needs space to move. It needs air. It needs your permission to thaw, because frozen fire doesn't die. It waits. It waits for you to stop holding it in place, to stop hiding from its heat, to stop fearing what it might destroy if you let it out. But fire doesn't just destroy. It clears. It renews. It breaks the shell so something truer can emerge. You may have held your fire frozen for years, a loss you never spoke of, a dream you abandoned, a truth you never let rise. You buried it under stillness, made it manageable, respectable, but deep down you feel it, a pressure, a fatigue that isn't tiredness, but resistance, because holding fire still is exhausting. So the paradox comes full circle. You froze the fire to survive, but now, to live you must let it burn, not recklessly, not destructively, but honestly. Let yourself feel the heat again. Let the tears come. Let the rage breathe. Let the grief move. You don't need to explode. You just need to melt, because beneath that still surface, you are full of life, and fire, when released, doesn't just consume, it illuminates. So ask yourself, what flame have I frozen? What fire am I afraid to feel? And what might happen if I let it rise? Not to destroy me, but to return me to the warmth I forgot I deserved. What does it mean to feel full while having nothing? What does it mean to be surrounded by everything, yet feel hollow inside? The paradox of empty fullness is not a contradiction of logic, it is a contradiction of being. It is the experience of having your hands overflowing while your heart remains empty. It's having all the answers, yet still feeling lost. It's standing in a room full of people and still feeling alone. In the modern world, this paradox is everywhere. We scroll endlessly through information, entertainment, connection, but deep inside, a quiet ache grows. We accumulate wealth, status, attention, but something vital is missing. We are full yet starved. It's like a banquet of plastic fruit. It looks vibrant, abundant, real. But when you bite into it, there's no nourishment, no taste, no meaning. Empty fullness often shows up when we confuse content with substance. We fill our time, we fill our feeds, we fill our calendars, but not our souls. We've become masters of distraction, mistaking stimulation for satisfaction, mistaking noise for connection, mistaking busyness for purpose. And the more we fill, the more we feel the void. That's the paradox. It's not that something's missing, it's that everything else is crowding it out. Imagine a room packed wall to wall with junk, So much stuff you can't even move. But in all that clutter, there's no space left for what you truly need. Love, silence, wonder, grief, presence. These things don't shout. They whisper. They need room to breathe. But when we're full of everything else, we can't hear them. In spiritual traditions, this paradox is ancient. Buddhism teaches that emptiness is not absence, it is openness, a space where truth can arise. Taoism says the usefulness of a bowl comes from its emptiness. Without emptiness, it cannot hold anything at all. In Christianity, the desert, the empty, barren places where prophets go to find God. And in your own life, the moments of deepest clarity likely didn't come when everything was perfect. They came in the silence after collapse, in the quiet after heartbreak, when everything else fell away and only your breath remained. That was fullness, real fullness, not crowded with things, but alive with meaning. So why do we fear emptiness? Because it feels like death, like boredom, like loneliness. But often, it's just the space where we finally meet ourselves. And that meeting can be terrifying, because in that space, there's no one to impress, no performance to hide behind, just you, raw, unmasked, real. But that's also where the healing begins. So, how do we live with empty fullness? We learn to make space, to choose depth over volume, to pause, to ask ourselves, is this filling me or distracting me? We declutter our minds. We remove the noise. We unplug from the endless stream of more. And in the quiet, something miraculous happens. We begin to feel full again. Not with stimulation, but with presence. Not with noise, but with awareness. That's when you realize it was never about adding more. It was about making room. You can own nothing and feel whole. You can be in silence and feel heard. You can be alone and feel connected. That is the power of empty fullness. It's not a state of lack. It's a different kind of abundance. An abundance of being rather than having. So, ask yourself, what have I filled my life with? And what am I actually hungry for? Because the answers don't live in more. They live in less. Not emptiness as a void, but emptiness as a vessel, ready, open, sacred. The fullness you crave has been waiting, not outside you, but beneath the clutter. And when you finally make space, you'll feel it rise up quietly, like light through an open window, like peace that doesn't need a reason, like truth that only speaks when the room goes still. Everything you've ever known about life tells you that time moves forward. A leads to be cause comes before effect. The match is struck, and then the flame appears. You act, and then the consequence follows. But what if that's not always true? The paradox of the timeless cause asks us to consider a world in which cause and effect are not chained in one direction, but folded upon each other, like pages in a book read out of order, where the cause of something might exist outside of time, or even stranger, after its effect. It sounds absurd until you realize how often we already live this way. Think about love. You fall for someone deeply, inexplicably, and then, over time, you find the reasons. But were those reasons the cause of your love? Or did your love cause you to reinterpret everything in its light? Or think about memory. You look back on a childhood moment, a conversation, a silence, a gaze, and now, years later, it takes on new meaning. You say, that's when everything changed. But did the change begin then? Or is it only now, with new eyes, that you create the cause? Physic 2. dances with this paradox in the realm of quantum mechanics. Particles don't always behave like obedient dominoes. Entangled particles can influence each other instantaneously, regardless of distance, and in some interpretations, even regardless of time. Effect and cause become slippery, recursive, intertwined. Some scientists have speculated that future events could influence the present. A particle's behavior today may be shaped by how it will be observed tomorrow. What does that mean for us? It means we might not be as bound to linearity as we think. We might be living in a world where time loops quietly beneath our every choice, where some causes are timeless or even retroactive. Imagine someone who dedicates their life to ending suffering. They never knew why they felt that mission so strongly, until, decades later, they lose a loved one in a way that explains everything. Their grief becomes the cause of their past actions, or was it? Maybe grief echoed backward through time, shaping them long before it arrived. Maybe the future whispered to the past, and the past listened. This isn't just science fiction, it's a psychological and spiritual truth we feel all the time. Intuition is a form of timeless cause, a knowing that precedes explanation, a gut feeling that turns out to be right. Synchronicity, to those strange coincidences that feel meaningful, as if time is nudging you toward a pattern, as if something outside the timeline is stitching events together for a deeper purpose. So how do we live with the paradox of timeless cause? We loosen our grip on linear thinking. We stop demanding that every moment justify itself immediately. We allow meaning to unfold across years. We make peace with not knowing why something matters, trusting that one day it might reveal itself. We begin to treat time not as a straight road, but as a spiral, events circling back deeper each time, causes buried like seeds in the soil of our future, and we begin to see ourselves not as victims of time, but as co-authors of it. You may already be shaping a moment you haven't yet lived. Your joy tomorrow might be healing your sorrow today. Your purpose may be writing your past into clarity right now. This doesn't mean there are no consequences, but it does mean that consequences, too, are alive, not fixed in stone, but evolving. The story you lived 10 years ago can change. Not in what happened, but in what it meant, because meaning is a kind of time-travel. So ask yourself, what have I dismissed because its cause didn't make sense? What in my past might still be in motion, waiting for a future that explains it? If your purpose isn't found in your past at all, but in your future, reaching backward to call you forward. A vacuum, by definition, is empty. A space devoid of matter, of air, of anything to grasp or feel. It is absence, stillness, silence, silence. And yet the paradox of the breathing vacuum asks us to imagine the impossible. A nothingness that breathes, too. Breathe is to take in and let out. It is motion, expansion, life. But how can a vacuum empty, cold, inert possess the rhythm of something alive? The answer lies not in logic, but in layers. In space, the most perfect vacuum we know, strange. Things still occur. Quantum fields shimmer. Particles blink in and out of existence. The vacuum is not dead. It is restless. The void isn't a final absence. It is a womb. It is waiting. It is potential in its rawest form. This is where the paradox begins to unfold. That what appears as nothing may actually be the most active thing in the universe. In quantum physics, the vacuum isn't truly empty. Even empty space is alive with fluctuation. Virtual particles emerge and disappear, borrowing energy from nothing, returning without a trace. It is as if the universe itself is breathing, even in its most silent corners. And this isn't just abstract theory. This vacuum energy, this breathing of the void, is believed to play a role in the expansion of the universe. The emptiness is doing something. It's pushing galaxies apart. So the paradox deepens. The nothingness isn't passive. It moves. It acts. It shapes everything. But you don't need to be a physicist to understand this. Think of your own moments of emptiness. Moments where everything fell away. Relationships, identity, certainty. You stood in a vacuum. No answers, no direction. And yet, within that silence, something pulsed. A strange rhythm. A quiet breath. You weren't gone. You were becoming. This is the paradox of the breathing vacuum in human form. That we need emptiness to renew. That in stillness we expand. Meditation teaches this. You sit, you breathe, you empty your mind. And somehow, in that nothingness, clarity arises. Peace returns. Creativity bubbles up. Not in the noise, but in the vacuum. Even grief reflects this. When someone we love is gone, we feel a hollow space inside us. It echoes, it hurts. And yet, strangely, that void breathes. It teaches, it softens, it becomes part of us. The vacuum doesn't remain dead. It makes room for something new. Philosophically, this paradox challenges our obsession with fullness. We think we must fill every silence, every space, every second. But maybe what we need is emptier moments to hear the breath of the void. To sense its rhythm, creation often starts in the vacuum. A writer stares at a blank page. A composer listens to silence. An artist faces a bare canvas. These are breathing vacuums, quiet spaces, pulsing with possibility, and even at the origin of everything, the same paradox appears. The Big Bang, our cosmic beginning, emerged from a vacuum. From stillness came explosion. From silence came song. So how do we live with this paradox? We stop fearing the empty spaces. We begin to recognize them as living. We let go of the need to immediately fill every gap with noise or distraction. Instead, we lean in. We listen, because in that nothingness you might find your next becoming. You might realize that the vacuum is not a void, but a breath held in, and when it exhales, the universe shifts. So ask yourself, where have I mistaken silence for absence? Where might emptiness be speaking to me? Where is the vacuum in my life? Not death, but birth. Imagine walking toward the horizon. No matter how far you go, it always stays the same distance ahead. You never arrive at it because the horizon isn't a place, it's a limit. It's always just at the edge of where you are. Now imagine this. What if everything you desire, truth, peace, fulfillment, understanding, was like that horizon, always right at the edge, always just out of reach? This is the paradox of the infinite edge. It tells us that the closer we move toward something ultimate, the more it recedes. The more we know, the more we realize we don't. The more we search for meaning, the more elusive it becomes. The more we try to define reality, the more it slips away. This isn't failure. It's a built-in feature of existence. Infinity is not something we reach, it is something we approach forever. Philosophers have long wrestled with this. Zeno's paradoxes questioned whether motion was even possible if you had to get halfway, then halfway again and again. How could you ever arrive? In modern mathematics, infinity is not a number. It's a concept, a direction. You can count forever and never get there. You can divide endlessly and never reach zero. But the paradox doesn't only live in numbers, it lives in our lives. You strive to become a better person, to be wiser, kinder, braver, and yet every time you grow, the edge of who you could be moves forward. You never arrive. You evolve. It's the same in art, in science, in spirituality. The closer you get to the truth, the more complex it becomes. The more clarity you gain, the more questions arise. This can be frustrating or beautiful. The infinite edge is a paradox because it turns completion into an illusion. It tells us that arrival is not the point, that wholeness is not in stopping, but in continuing. A mountain climber doesn't climb to stand still at the top. They climb because the act itself is alive. The striving is the becoming. Likewise, the edge is not where you fail to arrive. It is what keeps you moving. But there's more to this paradox. Sometimes the infinite edge shows up emotionally. You chase love, you chase success, you chase healing. And every time you think you're there, something shifts. Suddenly, your old definition no longer fits. The edge has moved. Why does this happen? Because you are not static, and neither is what you seek. You are a mirror in motion, chasing a reflection that evolves with you. So how do we live with this paradox? First, we stop thinking of the edge as a destination. We begin to see it as a companion, a guide, a challenge that keeps calling us forward. Instead of asking, when will I get there? We start asking, what am I becoming as I walk? We make peace with not arriving, with not knowing everything, with being in motion, because the infinite edge also protects us. If truth could be reached, it could be controlled. If meaning could be captured, it could be sold. If love could be possessed, it could be lost. But when these things live at the edge, they remain alive, eternal, unfinished, free. There's deep wisdom in this. It means we never run out of wonder. We never exhaust growth. There is always a next page, a next question, a next self. The paradox invites humility, but also endless creativity. You are not failing to reach the edge. You are living in relationship with it. So ask yourself, where have I demanded arrival when I was meant to grow? Where have I mistaken the infinite edge for a wall instead of a path? Because the edge isn't a barrier. It's a promise that there is more, always more, and that more will keep remaking you in ways you can't yet imagine. We usually think of speed and stillness as opposites. Speed is motion, acceleration, change. Stillness is calm, quiet, immobility. But the paradox of faster. Stillness asks something strange. Can something move so fast that it appears still? At first glance, it sounds nonsensical. But look closer. When a fan spins fast enough, the blades disappear. When a wheel turns quickly, it sometimes looks like it's spinning backwards, or not at all. In physics, this is known as a stroboscopic illusion. The faster it goes, the quieter it appears, until it blurs into invisibility. In this way, extreme motion can become indistinguishable from complete stillness. The paradox becomes psychological, too. Think about a life moving at such high speed that the person inside it feels frozen. There, racing through tasks, obligations, emails, commutes, but inside, numb, disconnected. Still, this is the experience of burnout, where you're moving constantly but feel like you're going nowhere. Stillness isn't always peace, and motion isn't always progress. But faster stillness isn't just about exhaustion. It's also about perception. Speed bends what we see. Motion at the extreme becomes something else entirely, in special relativity. As you approach the speed of light, time begins to slow. Distances contract, mass increases, and at the limit time appears to stop entirely. For light itself, there is no before or after. It moves endlessly, and yet, from its own frame of reference, it never moves at all. That's the paradox. The faster something moves through space, the slower it moves through time. Faster becomes stiller. This flips our intuition on its head. We think of motion as chaos, stillness as peace, but in reality, they're deeply connected to sides of a deeper rhythm. Monks have understood this for centuries. In deep meditation, they sit perfectly still. But internally, awareness sharpens to a speed that surpasses thought, still on the outside, vast on the inside. Or consider the paradox in martial arts. The master moves so fast that their strikes seem effortless, almost invisible. They are a blur but calm, fluid, precise. The storm outside is matched by the silence within. This paradox shows up in nature too. Think of a hummingbird's wings beating 80 times per second. So fast they vanish into a hum. They create the illusion of stillness in midair. The same is true of atoms. The chair you sit on seems solid, unmoving. But zoom in far enough, and its particles are vibrating wildly. An infinite dance beneath the surface of stillness. Stillness, then, is not the absence of motion. It is perfect motion, balanced in all directions, so fast, so aligned it disappears into calm. There's a lesson here for how we live. We chase stillness like it's something outside ourselves, a beach, a forest, a quiet room. But what if the deepest stillness is not in the slowing down, but in the aligning of motion? What if peace isn't the absence of speed, but the harmony of it? When every part of you is moving in the same direction, without resistance, without conflict, it feels like stillness. It's not idle, it's total unity. That's the paradox of flow, where time seems to vanish, where thought and action become one, where motion feels like meditation. And in those moments, you are going faster than ever, but you feel still. Still. So how do we live with this paradox? We stop thinking of stillness as immobility. We start seeing it as inner clarity, the kind that comes when your actions and intentions are not fighting each other. We look for alignment, not just silence. We ask, am I still because I'm lost? Or am I still because I'm moving in every direction at once? Am I busy because I'm chasing, or because I'm focused? Where in my life am I mistaking chaos for energy, and numbness for calm? The truth is, stillness is not a place, it's a state, and sometimes it takes great speed to reach it. So next time you feel overwhelmed or frozen, don't assume you've stopped moving. You may just be moving so fast that only your soul can see it. What happens when you divide by zero? The question sounds simple. We've all asked it. We've all typed it into calculators or equations. But the answer is never what we expect, because dividing by zero is not just difficult, it's impossible. Or perhaps worse, it breaks the very system trying to answer it. This is the paradox of dividing zero. Let's step into it slowly, in ordinary math. If you divide something, say 10 apples by 2, you get 5. You're just splitting a whole into equal parts. If you divide by 1, nothing changes. But what if you divide by something smaller and smaller? 10 divided by 0.1 equals 100. 10 divided by 0.001 equals 10,000. 10 divided by 0.000001 equals 100 million. As the divisor approaches zero, the result shoots toward infinity. But the moment you try to divide by actual zero, everything collapses. Why? Because dividing by zero asks a question the universe refuses to answer. How many times can nothing go into something? It's not that the answer is hard to find. It's that the question itself is broken. And this is where the paradox deepens. Zero isn't just nothing. It's a symbol, a boundary between meaning and madness. It gives form to the void. It allows us to measure the absence of a thing. Zero is the silent skeleton behind all numbers. But the moment you try to divide with it, you unleash a riddle that math cannot contain. This isn't just theoretical. In computing, attempting to divide by zero can crash a program. In physics, it can produce infinite energy values-breaking models and equations. In philosophy, it evokes ancient questions about being and non-being. Can you take something and break it by asking nothing of it? That's what the paradox asks. Not just mathematically, but existentially. Think of relationships. How many times can you give love to someone who gives you nothing in return? How long can you offer trust into a void before the trust itself becomes meaningless? Dividing zero becomes a metaphor for emotional collapse, a warning about investing energy into absence. Or think of identity. How many roles can you divide yourself into before there's nothing left at the center? When your sense of self is split too thinly across expectations, personas, social masks, what's left when you try to come home to yourself? Sometimes it feels like zero, and trying to divide again breaks the whole structure. Dividing zero is a paradox because it tempts you with the illusion of a solution. You see the equation. You believe an answer must exist. But what if the answer is that the question shouldn't be asked? This reveals a powerful truth. Not every problem can be solved. Not every situation can be measured. Some things are undefined. Not because they're too hard, but because they undo the meaning of definition itself. So how do we live with this paradox? First, we recognize our limits, not with shame, but with awe. We stop trying to force sense out of nonsense. We stop inserting effort into spaces where nothing can be returned. We accept that some voids should remain untouched. Not every silence demands to be filled. Not every emptiness is meant to be solved. And maybe that's the deeper purpose of the paradox, to remind us that boundaries matter, that trying to extract infinite meaning from zero substance is a recipe for collapse, that even truth needs structure, and some questions protect us by refusing to answer. So ask yourself, where in my life am I trying to divide by zero? Where am I demanding answers from emptiness? Where am I mistaking the lack of return for something I should fix, rather than something I should leave? The paradox doesn't tell us to stop seeking. It tells us to seek wisely, because sometimes the most powerful act is to leave the void alone. What if something with weight, with presence, with form, with undeniable substance, could simply vanish? Not by moving, not by being hidden, but by changing the way it exists, until it ceases to be matter at all. This is the paradox of vanishing mass. It begins in physics, at the mysterious boundary between mass and energy. Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc, tells us that mass and energy are interchangeable. Under the right conditions, mass can become energy, and energy, in turn, can manifest as mass. A piece of matter, then, isn't solid in the way we think. It's stored energy held together in a temporary pattern, a configuration of vibrating fields, momentarily stable. So what happens when that pattern is undone? A tiny amount of matter, less than a grain of sand, can unleash the force of an atomic bomb when converted into energy. In that moment, mass disappears, but it hasn't gone nowhere. It's become light, heat, shockwave. It's still there, but now ungraspable. That's vanishing mass. The paradox of something real becoming something invisible, yet undeniable. But this isn't just physics. This is also a metaphor for the self, for how something you once carried heavily can transform, not by being removed, but by being changed. Think of grief. At first, it's solid, heavy. It lives in your chest, your throat, your bones. But over time, it becomes something else. Not gone, but diffused. It becomes a memory, a dream, a quiet echo that hums instead of screams. The weight vanishes, yet its energy remains. The paradox of vanishing mass teaches us that disappearance is not always absence. Sometimes it's transformation. It also challenges how we think about permanence. We like to believe that what's physical is what's most real, that what we can touch, weigh, hold in our hands will last the longest. But all matter decays. All stars burn out. All bodies return to dust. Mass doesn't last, but the energy it releases can ripple out forever. This paradox also lives in memory. A person you loved is gone. Their body is no longer here, but their presence, in your habits, your laughter, your choices, still radiates. They've vanished and yet remain. This is vanishing mass. To dot, it shows up in culture. An idea takes form, becomes a movement, a revolution, a structure, then it collapses. But the energy it unleashed keeps shaping history. The form vanishes, the force continues. So how do we live with this paradox? We stop clinging to the visible. We start trusting the unseen. We recognize that what leaves isn't always lost, and what fades doesn't always fail. We understand that letting go of form doesn't mean letting go of meaning in our own lives. We often resist change because we fear disappearance. We fear losing the shape we've known. But what if the shape was never the point? What if the energy is what we carry forward? Vanishing mass asks us to loosen our grip, to accept that even the heaviest burdens may dissolve, not because we dropped them, but because we transformed, and perhaps even more powerfully, it reminds us that we too are temporary forms, brief structures of energy, walking through time. One day, our mass will vanish, but the love we gave, the words we said, the ripples we created will continue. So ask yourself, what am I holding on to that's ready to transform? What part of me has vanished in form, but remains in energy? What weight am I mistaking for permanence, when it's just waiting to become light? In a universe where matter dissolves, but meaning remains, vanishing mass isn't a loss, it's a shift, from body to impact, from weight to wave, from now to forever. Imagine standing in a vast canyon. You shout, but there's no reply, no bounce, no return, only the space where an echo should have been. Now imagine the reverse. You never spoke, but an echo comes anyway, a ripple through the air, the walls, the mind answering a question you never asked. This is the paradox of echo, without sound, a phenomenon where the response precedes the stimulus, where presence exists without origin, and where silence rings louder than noise. In the physical world, an echo is a return, a delayed repetition caused by sound waves reflecting off distant surfaces. It is evidence that something was said, that space was touched. But what if the echo remains after the sound has faded? Or worse, what if there was never a sound at all? This paradox asks us to consider traces without causes, a memory without an event, a trauma without a wound, a longing with no name. It lives in the moments when you feel sorrow without knowing why, when a smell or a shadow tugs at something ancient inside you, but you can't remember what. It lives in déjà vu, in inherited grief, in ancestral echoes passed down through generations, felt in the body but never spoken aloud. Somewhere inside you is a response to a story you were never told. Echo without sound is the sound of unspoken things. It's the scream that never came, the goodbye that was never said, the love that was never returned, but still imprinted on your bones in relationships. This paradox is everywhere. You meet someone new, but feel the weight of something old. You respond with fear, or need, or distance, not because of what they did, but because of something that echoes through them. And they carry echoes, too, of past pain, of forgotten desires, of parents, places, lives they don't speak of. We are all responding to sounds no one else hears. Sometimes, an echo without sound is the ache of potential, the haunting of what could have been. It is the presence of an unlived life, the echo of a door you didn't open. You feel it when you're still, when the world quiets, and something presses against the edge of your consciousness. A ghost made not of memory, but of possibility. This paradox also lives in the mind. Thoughts echo long after words are gone. You replay a conversation. You imagine a confrontation that never happened. You feel shame or pride about things you only dreamed of doing. These are echoes without sound, and yet they shape us. They influence decisions, color emotions, and bend the future in subtle ways. So what is the lesson of this paradox? It reminds us that silence is not empty, that absence can be powerful, that what is unspoken may still leave a mark. In fact, it often does. The things we don't express echo the loudest. The apology not given, the truth avoided, the identity suppressed, all of it echoes. And like any echo, it grows louder in the right space. So how do we live with this paradox? We listen, not just with ears, but with intuition, with presence, with the willingness to sit in silence and let the echoes rise. We stop assuming that every feeling needs a name, that every ache needs a source. We learn to honor the mystery, to recognize that we are more than what happened to us. We are also shaped by what almost happened, what never happened, what echoes through the lives of those before us. And most of all, we learn to speak, because sometimes the only way to end an echo is to give it the sound it never had, to write the letter, to say the words, to name the ghost. So ask yourself, what am I echoing that was never truly mine? What silence do I keep that's waiting to be voiced? What unspoken truth still lives in me like a soundless ripple? The paradox of echo without sound is not a puzzle to be solved. It's a presence to be felt, and maybe one day finally heard. What if light could be touched? What if something that's supposed to be weightless, a wave, a shimmer, a flash, could be held in your hand like a stone? This is the paradox of solid light, an idea that violates everything we know and yet, strangely, whispers something true about the way reality bends. Light is, by definition, untouchable. It moves at a universal speed limit. It dances across surfaces, reflects in mirrors, refracts through glass, but it never rests, never freezes, never offers resistance. It has no mass in the traditional sense. It carries energy. It reveals the world. But it doesn't seem to belong to the world it illuminates. And yet, under the right conditions, light behaves like a particle, a photon, a unit of something almost physical. Quantum physics tells us light is both a wave and a particle, a duality that defies logic. It isn't either or, it's both. And if it can be a particle, can it be solid? There are experiments now, lasers cooled to near absolute zero that can make photons interact, collide, even form temporary molecules of light. This isn't science fiction, it's cutting-edge physics. Solid light isn't just metaphor. It's a possible reality, but beyond the lab, this paradox asks a deeper question. What happens when something intangible becomes real? When the metaphor becomes matter? Think of love, or truth, or memory. These are things you cannot touch, but you feel them. They shape your decisions, your beliefs, your identity. Then one day you see a photo, hear a song, touch an old scarf, and suddenly that memory becomes solid. The intangible becomes tactile. This is solid light. Not in science, but in experience. The paradox reminds us that not all reality is physical, but it can still become form. We often think in binaries, light or dark, real or unreal, visible or invisible. But the world isn't binary. It's a spectrum. Solid light lives in the gray areas. In those moments when something crosses a boundary it shouldn't be able to cross, and yet does. You can't touch light, but you can be burned by it. You can't weigh a moment, but it can crush you. You can't see gravity, but it holds you in place. This paradox shows us that impact doesn't require solidity, and presence doesn't require substance. It also challenges how we define real. We live in an age that prioritizes what can be measured, what can be tested, what can be proven, but some of the most powerful forces in your life, love, fear, beauty, time, are not solid, and yet they shape your world more than bricks or steel. Solid light invites us to rethink our definitions, to stop waiting for something, to be physical in order to believe it's real. It also warns us, sometimes the things we think we can't be hurt by leave the deepest marks. A word, a glance, a silence. They are not fists, but they land like them. This is the weight of invisible things. So how do we live with this paradox? We learn to see substance in what seems insubstantial. We stop demanding proof before feeling. We understand that meaning is not always measurable, but it is still real, and perhaps we begin to trust our perceptions a little more. You don't need to touch something for it to matter. You don't need to explain something for it to be true. So ask yourself, what forces in my life have no form but shape everything? What truths do I deny because they're not solid enough? What light have I been afraid to touch, fearing it might burn or illuminate too much? The paradox of solid light is a mirror. It shows you what you've been pretending isn't real, simply because it isn't easy to hold. But just because something can't be grasped doesn't mean it can't change everything you are. What happens when emptiness begins to move? Not just drift, but spin faster and faster, as if it had a purpose, a center, a gravity of its own. This is the paradox of spinning void, where motion exists without mass, where direction emerges from absence, and where nothing becomes the most dynamic thing in the room. Let's begin in the universe, in deep space, far from stars or planets. There is vacuum, silence, stillness, and yet this stillness is never truly still. quantum physics, tells us that even in perfect vacuum, there are fluctuations. Particles appear and vanish. Waves ripple without cause. The void is not empty. Now add motion. Imagine that nothing begins to spin, but spin around what? There is no center, no object, no structure, just motion. And yet that spin creates effects. Distortions in space-time, gravitational waves, even hints of mass-stop motion from nothing, weight from emptiness, impact without substance. That's the spinning void. But this isn't just theoretical. Cosmology, it's also psychological. In your mind, you've likely felt the same phenomenon. A thought that begins with nothing. No reason, no origin, but it starts to loop around and around until it gathers momentum, becomes anxiety, paranoia, obsession. There is no original cause, only motion. A spinning void of thought, and like gravity, it pulls in everything nearby. Suddenly, your day feels heavier, your breath shallower, your sense of control dissolves. What began as nothing now moves everything. Spinning void shows us that absence isn't neutral. It can be dynamic. It can gain momentum. It can, in time, become unbearable. It's the feeling of being overwhelmed by something that doesn't exist, of arguing with a scenario that hasn't happened, of defending yourself against an imagined threat. Void becomes motion. Motion becomes reality. In relationships too, the spinning void appears. The silence between words, the pause between texts, the unanswered glance. We begin spinning, interpreting, imagining, predicting. They must be angry. They must be pulling away. I must have done something wrong, even when there is no signal. We generate motion. The void spins us. This paradox warns us. Stillness is not always safe. Absence is not always empty. We are meaning-making creatures. We fear vacuums, so we spin. We assign motives, stories, explanations. Even if they're wrong, we would rather move in the wrong direction than stand in true uncertainty. But here's the twist. The void only spins because we let it. It is not movement itself that harms us. It's unconscious momentum. So how do we live with this paradox? We become still on purpose. We notice the spin and name it. We say, this is a thought spiral. This is absence pretending to be danger. This is my fear animating a void. We pause. We breathe. We choose motion only when it's grounded in clarity, not in compulsion. We ask ourselves, what am I trying to fill? What silence am I spinning away from? Because sometimes the spinning void is just grief, or loneliness, or shame, begging to be witnessed, not avoided. Sometimes the spin is a message. You haven't stopped long enough to feel this. And if we're brave enough, we can stop. Let the void be still. Let it be empty. Let it be. Because in that moment, we realize the void only had power while it spun. Stillness takes it back. So ask yourself, what part of my life is spinning with no center? What story am I repeating that began with nothing? What truth have I ignored because I was too busy spinning to see it? The paradox of the spinning void reminds us, motion isn't always progress. Activity isn't always healing. Sometimes, the most courageous thing is to sit with nothing and let it stay nothing. Time moves forward. Eggs don't uncrack. Ashes don't leap back into flames. Memories don't precede moments. Entropy always rises until it DOESN. Single quotes, this is the paradox of backward entropy, where the universe seems to defy its own law. Of decay, where disorder rewinds itself into improbable order, and where the arrow of time bends or breaks. Entropy is a measure of chaos. In every closed system, disorder increases over time. This isn't a theory, it's one of the most fundamental rules of thermodynamics. It's why your room gets messy if you don't clean it, why heat dissipates, why stars die, why everything breaks down. Eventually, entropy is the one-way flow of time. The reason the past is not the future, but backward entropy proposes something unthinkable, that under the right conditions, chaos could reverse. That shattered glass might reassemble, that melted ice might reform, that the future might resemble a restored past. In theoretical physics, some equations work perfectly in both directions. They don't care if time moves forward or back. The laws are symmetrical, yet our experience of time is not. So where does this asymmetry come from? Some argue it's entropy, that time itself is a product of increasing disorder. And if entropy ran in reverse, so would time. Imagine waking up, each day younger than the one before. Memories would build backward. Experience would collapse into innocence. All effects would precede their causes, and meaning, as we know it, would dissolve. Backward entropy is not just a physics riddle, it's a philosophical earthquake, because it asks, is decay truly inevitable? Or is our perception of it just a habit? We often assume that decline is natural, that relationships fall apart, that bodies age, that systems fail. But what if that direction isn't fixed? What if at some scale, in some dimension, there exists a mirror world where things unbreak, the implications stretch beyond? Science, in grief, we long for backward entropy, to rewind the moment before the loss, to say what wasn't said, to undo what couldn't be stopped. But time refuses. Entropy laughs. And yet, there are moments when the arrow blurs, when a memory is so vivid, it feels like it's happening now. When a wound heals so completely, it's as if it never occurred. When a destroyed connection is miraculously restored. These are emotional echoes of backward entropy, not in matter, but in meaning. They remind us that not all entropy is physical, that hearts and histories have their own arrows, and sometimes they turn. Backward entropy is also a metaphor for healing. The brain, after trauma, can rewire itself. The psyche can rebuild shattered stories. A soul can find order again, not by erasing the past, but by reinterpreting it. Is that not a form of reversed chaos? When someone forgives, when someone returns, when someone reclaims what was broken, that too is entropy, undone. But there's a danger here. Because the dream of backward entropy can trap us in nostalgia, in rumination, in the futile hope that time owes us a do. Dash over dot. It dots is not a promise. It's a provocation, a reminder that what seems irreversible might still surprise us, that what's lost might echo back, not in the same form, but in some strange symmetry. So how do we live with this paradox? We stop assuming time is a straight line. We learn to see patterns in decay. We understand that destruction is not always permanent, but neither is resurrection guaranteed. We work not to rewind life, but to restore meaning within it. We embrace the strange grace of forward motion, while holding space for mystery. So ask yourself, what part of me believes it's too late? What chaos have I accepted as irreversible? Where might my life be waiting for a quiet reversal? The paradox of backward entropy whispers, Maybe not all endings are final. Maybe some ashes remember the flame. Maybe, just maybe, time isn't as one way as we think. We often think of movement as freedom, a bird in flight, a river flowing, a dancer spinning across a stage. Motion is supposed to be light, effortless, even graceful. But what if motion could become a burden? What if the faster you moved, the heavier you became? This is the paradox of heavier motion, where velocity adds weight, where speed multiplies inertia, and where motion itself begins to trap you. In the world of physics, this paradox has roots. According to Einstein's theory of relativity, as an object approaches the speed of light, its mass effectively increases. The faster it moves, the harder it is to accelerate. At light speed, its mass would become infinite. Motion, in this sense, does not liberate, it imprisons. And yet, this isn't just a scientific oddity, it's a reflection of how we live, think. About your own life. The more you do, the more there is to carry. The faster your pace, the harder it becomes to slow down. Work, goals, habits, routines, all in motion, all accumulating momentum. But also wait. You say yes to one thing, then another. You start moving faster, more tasks, more expectations. Soon, you can't stop, because stopping means crashing, because stillness feels like failure. We live in cultures addicted to motion. Productivity is praised, rest is suspicious, stillness is mistaken for laziness. But with every added motion comes more mass, more weight, more resistance to change. You begin to define yourself by your motion, what you do, how fast you move, what you achieve, and that identity becomes heavy, too heavy to shed, too fast to question. This paradox shows us that the very thing we chase, momentum, can become the very thing that crushes us. Heavier motion appears in emotional life. 2. When you suppress grief to keep moving, it doesn't disappear, it becomes heavier the longer you avoid it. When you push past exhaustion, you begin to carry fatigue like invisible weight, your body moving, but your soul dragging behind. Even relationships can reflect this paradox. To people moving too fast, into love, into conflict, into decisions, can generate a kind of emotional gravity, a weight that pulls on them, even when they try to walk away. Heavy emotion is also seen in ambition. The dream that once inspired you now demands you never pause. Because if you slow down, you might feel how tired you are. You might wonder if the dream still fits. But motion doesn't ask, it only pulls. So how do we live with this paradox? We recognize that speed is not always strength. That movement without intention is just noise. That progress, real progress, sometimes requires stopping. We learn to measure life not just by velocity, but by alignment. Not just by how much we do, but by why we're doing it. We ask ourselves, is this momentum still mine? Or am I just being carried? Am I chasing speed because I'm afraid of silence, of what I might feel if I slowed down? We also learn to interrupt the spin, to pause, to rest, to question the weight we carry, because sometimes the fastest way forward is to stand still. Sometimes releasing motion is how we become light again. The paradox of heavy emotion warns us. Don't confuse velocity with freedom. Don't assume that more movement equals more meaning, because motion without direction becomes mass without purpose, and that weight, over time, will bury you. So ask yourself, where am I moving just to avoid stopping? What part of me believes I'll lose value if I slow down? What would it take to drop the weight of constant motion? The answer is not to stop moving forever, but to move intentionally, to choose speed only when it serves you, not when it controls you. Because motion is only freedom when you can still choose to be still. Light reveals. It makes things visible. It chases away fear, uncertainty, and confusion. We've always seen darkness as its opposite, a void, a threat, a lack. But what if darkness, too, could reveal? What if it wasn't absence, but a different kind of presence? This is the paradox of darkness. Illuminated, a world where shadows don't conceal, but expose. Where blindness leads to clarity, and where the unseen tells more truth than the seen. We're trained to trust our eyes, to believe that what we see is real. What's in the light is knowable. What's in the dark is dangerous. But darkness isn't always the enemy. In fact, sometimes it's the only space where real understanding can take root. Think of the night sky, what gives it beauty? It's not just the stars, it's the blackness that surrounds them. Without darkness, light has no contrast, no frame, no depth. We don't stare at the sun to understand the universe. We look into the dark, because only there can we see the galaxies stretch out like whispers. In our lives, too, darkness reveals. Pain teaches. Loss clarifies. Loneliness speaks truths that company drowns out. It is in the dark moments that we meet ourselves stripped of distraction, raw and unlit. Many people only begin to understand who they are after everything else has fallen away. When the job is gone, when the relationship ends, when the lights go out literally or figuratively, that's when we find the shape of our soul. That's when the dark begins to glow. Darkness illuminated is not about glorifying suffering. It's about honoring it as a teacher that doesn't shout but whispers, and only those willing to sit in the dark can hear its voice. This paradox shows up in art. To dot, a painter uses shadow to give form. A composer uses silence to give music space. A writer uses the unsaid to deepen meaning. Darkness isn't the absence of beauty. It is often its container, and yet we resist it. We flood our homes with light. We fill our schedules with noise. We avoid quiet solitude, stillness. Why? Because in darkness, the distractions fall away, and we're left with what's real, with what hurts, with what needs tending. But we fear that if we face it, it will consume us. The paradox tells us the opposite, that in facing the dark, we begin to see. That in surrendering to not knowing, we begin to understand. Darkness gives us depth. It gives us distance. It gives us meaning. Even in nature, seeds sprout in soil, not sunlight. Babies grow in wombs, not windows. Rest and healing happen in sleep, not in wakefulness. Growth real. Foundational growth often begins in the dark. So how do we live with this paradox? We stop running from shadow. We stop pretending light is always better. We allow ourselves to pause, to reflect, to feel. We stop asking every question to be answered immediately. We allow some mysteries to stay mysterious. And we remember that the mind, like the eye, needs darkness to rest, to adjust, to make out new shapes in unfamiliar spaces. Ask yourself, what darkness have I been avoiding? What pain have I refused to learn from? What silence have I been too loud to hear? And then ask, what truth might emerge if I stop trying to light it all up? Because maybe some things are only visible when we close our eyes. Maybe the soul, like film, needs darkness to develop. Maybe darkness isn't the opposite of illumination. Maybe it's its foundation. The paradox of darkness, Illuminated asks us to trust that not all clarity is bright, not all wisdom is loud, and not all light comes from the sun. Gravity is supposed to pull us down. It anchors us, grounds us. It keeps our feet on the earth and our world in orbit. But what if gravity could rise instead of fall? What if the very force that holds everything down began to lift? This is the paradox of rising gravity, a strange reversal where weight no longer falls but climbs, where burden is not about descent but elevation, and where the closer you get to the heights, the heavier everything becomes. In physics, gravity is a force of attraction. The more mass, the stronger the pull. A black hole, for instance, has such intense gravity that not even light can escape. But in the paradox of rising gravity, climbing higher doesn't lighten the load, it increases it. Success weighs more than failure. Wisdom feels heavier than ignorance. Awareness becomes a kind of burden that ignorance never carried. It's easy to imagine freedom at the top of a mountain, of a career, of consciousness. But the higher you climb, the more gravity pulls on you. Every decision matters more. Every misstep risks a harder fall. Every insight demands responsibility. The paradox is that growth doesn't make things easier. It often makes them harder. Clarity isn't always liberating. Sometimes it hurts. It shows you the truths you can't unsee, the patterns you can't excuse, the people you can't follow anymore. And this awareness has weight you rise, but it pulls on your soul. Rising gravity also appears in emotional healing. You expect that healing will make you feel lighter, and sometimes it does, but often it first makes you feel everything you worked so hard to avoid. The higher you rise in self-awareness, the more gravity you feel from your past, from your responsibilities, from the people who haven't risen with. You'll start to see that true elevation isn't about escaping weight, it's about carrying it with intention, even spiritually. Rising gravity exists. Enlightenment is not a blissful float into nothingness. It's often a painful descent into compassion, where your heart becomes too soft to ignore the world's suffering. You rise, and the world feels heavier. You love deeper, and it hurts more. You know more, and certainty becomes impossible. This is not a punishment. It's the cost of elevation. Like climbing a mountain with thinner air, you get higher, but breathing becomes difficult. The view expands, but the journey strains. So how do we live with rising gravity? We stop expecting growth to feel good. We stop assuming wisdom comes with ease. We honor the weight that comes with awareness. We say, yes, this hurts because I'm finally awake. Yes, this is hard because I've stopped numbing. Yes, this feels heavier because I'm standing taller. We reframe the burden not as failure, but as proof of transformation, because only those who've risen know how heavy the sky can be. Rising gravity also teaches empathy. When you see someone strong, don't assume they're light. Their strength may come from carrying more than you. No, they may be rising, but it's costing them gravity. Ask yourself, what weight has come with your growth? What truths are heavier now than they were before? Where have you mistaken pain for regression when it was actually elevation? And then ask, what if I'm not falling behind, but rising into greater gravity? The paradox reminds us, don't confuse heaviness with wrongness. Sometimes the weight means you're exactly where you should be. You're not broken, you're rising. And with every step upward, you grow stronger, not by shedding gravity, but by learning to carry it with grace. Fire consumes, it devours. It turns the tangible into smoke and ash, evidence of transformation, of destruction, of change. But what if fire didn't burn? What if it illuminated without damage? What if the flame could flicker, without consuming a thing? This is the paradox of the unburning flame, a fire that gives light but leaves no scar, a passion that fuels without destroying, an intensity that does not demand a cost. It seems impossible, because we've always known flames by what they take. Wood, flesh, memory, they mark time by what's lost, but the unburning flame refuses. That law, it's not absence of fire, it's fire with a different kind of purpose. Imagine desire that doesn't become obsession, ambition that doesn't destroy sleep or soul, love that doesn't leave you in ruins, a flame that warms but doesn't wound. We are taught that anything powerful must consume, that passion must demand sacrifice, that love must hurt, that creativity must come from madness, that truth must cost you everything. And so we burn ourselves in pursuit of meaning. We chase intensity, thinking it must hurt to be real. We assume that fire is the only way to prove aliveness. But the unburning flame asks, what if the opposite is true? What if your most authentic passion leaves you whole, not broken? What if you can shine without shattering? In emotional life, this paradox is revolutionary. So many of us avoid passion because we associate it with danger. Love scorched us. Dreams burned out. Anger consumed us. So we douse the flame entirely. We dim, we retreat. But the unburning flame invites something else to rekindle without fear, to find the kind of fire that purifies, not punishes. It's the love that doesn't manipulate, the work that energizes instead of drains, the truth that frees instead of isolates. It's the light you carry that doesn't set fire to your own home. In spiritual traditions, the unburning flame shows up. To think of the burning bush in the story of Moses, a flame that blazed but did not consume. It was sacred, holy ground, a symbol of revelation that did not destroy the vessel. In psychological healing, the same metaphor applies. You learn to revisit old pain without being reburned. You can touch the memory without reigniting the trauma. You carry your story like a lantern, not a wildfire. This paradox also asks something subtle. Are you addicted to the burn? Are you chasing fire because you think you must suffer to feel alive? Because you equate exhaustion with effort, drama with love, sacrifice with worth. Then the unburning flame becomes a challenge. Can you stay lit without melting? Can you stay fierce without scorching? Can you burn without burning out? To live this paradox is to become a new kind of torchbearer. You become a steady flame, not a flash, not a wildfire, but a constant light in a world addicted to collapse. So how do we live with this paradox? We stop glorifying the burn. We stop believing pain is proof of purpose. We start seeking passion that nourishes. We relearn intensity as presence, not punishment. We light the fire and let it glow, not consume. Ask yourself, where have I mistaken burnout for bravery? Where have I scorched myself to keep others warm? Where can I rekindle a flame that does not burn me down? The paradox of the unburning flame whispers, your light does not need to hurt. Your fire is not meant to destroy. You were made to glow, not to turn to ash. Shine with softness. Burn with balance. Illuminate without erasing, because the brightest fires aren't always the hottest, and the most powerful flames leave no smoke behind. Time, to most of us, flows forward. It marches on, from past to present to future. It's a one-way current, pulling everything with it. Birth, growth, decay, death. You don't rewind it. You don't outrun it. You only follow. But what if time could move backward, not metaphorically What if cause came after effect? What if memories were made before moments happened? This is the paradox of negative time. A world where time flows in reverse, where the future bleeds into the present, where the past hasn't happened yet, and where your actions today are reactions to a tomorrow already written in theoretical physics. Negative time isn't fiction. Some equations work perfectly when you reverse time's direction. Mathematically, there's nothing stopping it. But reality resists the idea. Why? Because time, as we know it, is deeply psychological. It's not just clocks and calendars. It's the story we tell ourselves to make sense of change. Negative time breaks that story. It unravels everything. Imagine remembering things you haven't experienced, dreaming of futures that shape the present more than memory ever could, or reacting to emotions you've never felt yet. Some physicists propose that particles at the quantum level don't obey time's direction. They appear to know outcomes before they happen. A photon might choose its path only when you look at it, even if that choice was made retroactively, as though the present reshapes the past. So what does this mean for your own life? It raises a terrifying and beautiful question. What if you're already being shaped by something you haven't yet encountered? What if the most important event in your life hasn't happened, but is already echoing backward into who you are now? Maybe that unexplained intuition, that sudden clarity, that pull you can't describe, isn't from behind you, but from ahead. In emotional terms, we often live in negative time without realizing it. Anxiety is a perfect example. You feel fear now because of something that hasn't occurred. The future's shadow leaks into the present, and the mind responds to it as though it's already real. Hope, too, is a kind of reverse gravity. You endure pain today because of something you believe is waiting, not because of what's behind you, but because of what you imagine. Ahead, in healing, negative time can be a gift. Sometimes, people begin to change before they can explain why. A part of them senses what's coming, what will be required, and they begin, quietly, to prepare. They drop old habits. They let go of toxic attachments, not because of the past, but because the future is already calling. That's the beauty of this paradox. The future isn't waiting. It's reaching for you. But there's a dark side too. If time moves backward, regret becomes prophecy. Trauma doesn't just echo forward, it loops. You might live as if fate has already spoken. You might stop trying because you think the ending has already arrived. This is where negative time becomes dangerous. It tempts you to believe your future is fixed, but the paradox holds a deeper truth. Even if time folds, loops, or reverses, even if the future pulls instead of pushes, you still choose how to respond. You may not control the timeline, but you control the thread you follow through it. So how do we live with this paradox? We start listening more closely to the things that don't yet make sense. We stop dismissing intuition as fiction. We stop assuming the present is the only place where meaning begins. We allow ourselves to be shaped not only by what's behind us, but by what might lie ahead. Ask yourself, what future am I already living toward? What decision is echoing backward into my now? What have I been feeling that doesn't belong to this moment, but to another waiting for me? The paradox of negative time teaches us this. The arrow of time may not be as straight as we believe. The present might be less about memory and more about alignment. And your truest self may already exist in a moment you have yet to live. Explosions are loud. They announce themselves with fury, with fire, shatter, shock. They leave no doubt that something has changed. But what if an explosion made no sound? What if the most powerful detonation occurred in total silence? This is the paradox of the silent explosion, a moment of immense transformation with no thunder. A collapse or awakening so total that it doesn't scream, it simply happens. We expect rupture to be noisy. We wait for life to make a scene when it breaks. We think collapse must involve chaos. But often, the loudest shifts in our lives happen quietly. No fireworks, no sirens, just a stillness. And then, nothing is the same again. Imagine someone who changes their entire worldview while washing dishes. A breakdown that begins not with a cry, but with a long, numb stare. An awakening that isn't shouted from rooftops, but whispered within the chest. This paradox reveals something essential, that intensity does not require volume, that some of the most devastating or liberating events arrive without spectacle. It happens in trauma. A child doesn't always scream. Sometimes they go silent, and that silence, it detonates inside them for decades. It happens in realization. One day you just know. You see clearly, not because of an argument or an accident, but because something internal shifted. No drama, no announcement, just an inner implosion that rewrites your entire understanding. The silent explosion also shows up in science, in space. When stars go supernova, there is no sound. Despite the energy being released, no one hears it, because in the vacuum of space, silence reigns. Massive, universe-shaping forces operating in total quiet, and yet, they leave behind light years of consequences. What if your inner world works the same way? What if the most important revolutions don't roar, they ripple? The paradox warns us not to confuse silence with peace. Stillness can hide storms. Just because someone isn't crying doesn't mean they aren't shattering. Just because a society looks calm doesn't mean it's not collapsing from within. Sometimes, the bomb has already gone off, and you're just now feeling the heat. This is true in healing. People often expect transformation to look dramatic. They wait for a sign, a breakdown, a climax. But more often, healing begins in a quiet choice. I won't do this anymore. I deserve better. I'm tired of surviving. The voice barely rises, but the impact is seismic. A relationship ends, not in a fight, but in a long silence over dinner. A belief dies, not in public, but in the quiet refusal to repeat it. A person changes not when the world forces them to, but when something inside quietly rearranges and decides not to be the same. So how do we live with the paradox of silent explosion? We learn to listen, not just for noise, but for shift. We stop assuming that meaning must be loud. We learn to respect the invisible ruptures. We ask, what have I dismissed because it wasn't dramatic? What quiet decision have I made that changed everything? We begin to trust our inner tectonic plates, the slow, quiet movements that eventually create mountains or earthquakes. we also learn to speak for those who go silent. Not all pain is voiced. Not all change is visible. Sometimes what breaks a person leaves no mark, but inside, the architecture is rubble, and sometimes, the explosion you survive is one no one else even heard. That doesn't make it any less real. In a world addicted to noise, the silent explosion is sacred. It reminds us that truth doesn't always come with a microphone, and that some of the most powerful moments are the ones no one else sees. So if you've ever changed quietly, if you've left a toxic place without a final scream, if you've realized something alone in the dark of your mind, if you've healed without applause, then you've lived this paradox. And maybe the fact that no one noticed is what made it real. Growth is supposed to have roots, a foundation, a stable core from which life can rise. We imagine trees planted deep in the earth, stretching skyward only because they are anchored below. Without roots, we believe, nothing can truly grow. But what if that's not always true? This is the paradox of rootless growth, expansion without stability, transformation without foundation, becoming something more while still not knowing where you belong. It feels wrong, doesn't it, to rise without grounding, to evolve while unanchored. But this paradox lives everywhere, in nature, in history, and especially in us. Think of a seed carried by the wind. It drifts. It doesn't know where it will land. And yet, sometimes it begins to sprout before it even touches soil. It reaches toward light even without knowing if there's earth beneath it in human life. This paradox appears when you're forced to grow before you're ready, when you must mature without safety, when life demands resilience in the absence of support. Children who raise themselves, immigrants who rebuild identities in unfamiliar lands, survivors who grow wiser because they had no choice. It's the student without a mentor, the artist without a home, the healer who never had someone to heal them. They bloom anyway, without permission, without roots. And that growth, though fragile, can be astonishing, but it comes with a cost. Rootless growth is often misunderstood. To others, it may look unstable, chaotic, reckless even. Why don't you settle down? Why can't you commit? Why are you always changing? Because sometimes you must grow to survive, even if the ground never shows up. And sometimes growth itself becomes the root. You keep moving, not because you're lost, but because you've learned to grow through motion. Still, rootless growth is not painless. It carries loneliness. You may feel like an imposter in your own life, unworthy of your progress because you don't know where it came from. You may wonder, if I don't belong anywhere, does my growth count? The paradox replies, yes, it counts even more, because it wasn't given to you. You forged it, out of confusion, out of necessity, out of thin air. Some people are born into fertile soil. Others learn to grow in the sky, and that upward stretch without safety is no less real than anything rooted deep in earth, in psychology. We see this in people who develop emotional insight before they've ever experienced emotional security. They learn how to comfort others without knowing comfort themselves. They offer wisdom they've never been taught, because life forced them to grow from cracks, not gardens. And spiritually, the rootless path is common. Mystics, exiles, seekers, they all grow by wandering. They don't settle, they don't plant, but they still become. So how do we live with this paradox? We stop shaming ourselves for not being grounded. We stop thinking we must get stable before we evolve. We stop assuming that chaos cancels out authenticity, we start honoring the growth that came from motion, from pain, from adaptation. Ask yourself, where have I grown without support? Where did I blossom even when no one believed in me? Where am I still stretching, even without a place to land? And then ask, what if being rootless was never a weakness, but a different kind of strength? Because there are vines that grow without soil, minds that expand without approval, souls that evolve without community. Rootless growth may be lonely, but it's not hollow. It is the path of the one who rises without needing to be held. You may not know where you belong, you may not have answers, but if you are still reaching, still blooming, then you are alive, you are growing, and that, paradoxically, is your root. Decay is supposed to mean the end, the unraveling, the breaking down of what once was whole, in nature, in bodies, in structures, in memory. Decay is the silent undoing that follows life. But what if decay never finishes its job? What if something could rot forever? This is the paradox of undying decay, where things fall apart endlessly, but never collapse completely. A process without a conclusion. A death that never finishes dying. At first glance, this sounds impossible. Decay, after all, leads to stillness. A carcass returns to soil. A house crumbles into rubble. A wound scabs, scars, fades. But some things erode in loops. A civilization that never quite dies, but never thrives again. A relationship that keeps hurting, but never ends. A habit you can't break, but also can't live with. You're always working on it, but never healed. Always letting go, but still clinging. Always almost there, but nowhere new. It's the heartbreak that never finishes breaking. The grief that doesn't lessen, just quiets. The guilt that becomes background noise, always humming. In biology, there are cells that begin to die, but don't complete the process. They linger in a twilight state, not alive, not dead, just malfunctioning. They're called senescent cells, and they contribute to aging and disease, a literal form of undying decay inside the body. In psychology, the same can happen with trauma. When a wound isn't fully processed, it lingers, not in sharp pain, but in dull cycles, repetition, patterns. You think you've moved on, but something still festers, still shapes your decisions, still whispers, and socially, undying decay infects institutions, systems that should collapse under their own failure, but persist, rotten but surviving, falling apart in slow motion while still holding power. This paradox shows us that not all destruction is clean. Some things don't shatter, they erode. Some endings don't finish, they bleed into the next day, and the next dot. So what do you do when you're stuck in undying decay? You can't rebuild because the ruin isn't complete. You can't rest because the fall never ends. It's a haunting kind of limbo. There's something deeply human about this state. We often live in between, not broken enough to start over, not whole enough to feel peace. You stay in the relationship because it hasn't gotten bad enough. You stay in the job because it's still tolerable. You keep the belief because you haven't found a better one. Decay becomes comfort, and comfort becomes a cage. So how do we live with this paradox? First, we name it. We admit when something is rotting without end. We stop waiting for collapse and start choosing it, not to give up, but to finally clear the wreckage. Sometimes healing begins not when things get better, but when we decide the decay has gone on long enough. Ask yourself, what am I letting erode instead of confronting? What has been almost dead in my life for too long? What am I afraid to bury because I don't know what will grow in its place? This paradox doesn't mean we are doomed. It means we must wake up to the slow deaths we've normalized, because some things don't heal until they're allowed to die, and some rebirths require funerals. Undying decay is not a life sentence, but it is a warning that stalling is not safety, that tolerating rot will never create growth. So if you're still here, still stuck in something slowly dissolving, know this: you are allowed to end it, to finish what pain began, to let decay complete its work, so that anything can finally live. Distance is supposed to take time. You cross it, you travel, you wait. A journey unfolds across moments, minutes, days, measured in footsteps, heartbeats, or miles. Closeness fades slowly, disconnection grows gradually. But what if distance could happen instantly? This is the paradox of instant distance. The sudden chasm between what was once close, the collapse of connection in a blink. Not because time passed, but because something unseen shifted. One moment, you're in love. The next, you feel like strangers. One moment, your dream feels possible. The next, it feels like someone else's life. One moment, you trust the world. The next, you don't recognize it. No warning, no goodbye, no farewell. Just instant distance, and all the aching silence that comes with it. It's like watching the light switch off. Not dim, not flicker, just gone. No footsteps receding, no emotional packing, no drama, just the sudden absence of warmth where there once was fire. This paradox teaches that distance isn't always about geography, or even about time. Sometimes it's psychic, sometimes it's internal. Sometimes the most painful gap is between what you thought and what you now know. Think of friendships. You're laughing together, familiar, tethered. Then they say one thing, or don't show up when it matters. Or you see something in their eyes that was always there, but never visible. And suddenly, you feel far, like they're behind glass. Like 1,000 miles wedged itself between you in a single moment. Or think of your identity. You've always believed something, lived a certain way. Then one realization, a book, a moment, a loss, and suddenly, who you were feels distant. Like you're watching your past self through a telescope. This paradox echoes in grief too. Someone dies, and though they were alive yesterday, today they are an entire universe away. Not gradually, not politely, but instantly. We aren't prepared for distance that arrives without movement. It scrambles our understanding of reality. It leaves no path back, because you didn't walk away from anything. It just vanished while you blinked. And yet, it's one of the most human experiences. Instant distance teaches that intimacy is not guaranteed by presence. You can lie next to someone and feel worlds apart. You can sit in your childhood bedroom and not feel like a child. You can return home and realize it no longer fits. That realization doesn't unfold, it detonates. And in that flash, you're far. So how do we live with this paradox? We stop expecting all departures to come with doors. We stop waiting for closure that will never arrive. We stop demanding that every disconnection makes sense. Instead, we learn to honor the sudden shift, to respect the moment when your body knows, even before your mind can explain. Sometimes, distance is not created by leaving, but by knowing, and knowing, once known, can never be unknown. We also learn not to blame ourselves for the vanishing. It's not always a failure, not always betrayal. Sometimes it's simply the collision between illusion and truth, between the map you were using and the land beneath your feet. Ask yourself, where did I become distant without choosing to? What connection in my life ended not with conflict, but with clarity? Where did I lose something in the same moment I realized it was never fully there? Instant distance is painful because it's merciless. There's no time to say goodbye, no ramp down, no echo. But it's also a gift. It's life, telling you that something fundamental just shifted, that your internal compass is real, that your perceptions are sharp as a form of truth. So instead of mourning only what's lost, you begin to honor what's been revealed, because sometimes distance shows up not to punish you, but to protect you, to carve space between who you were and who you're now becoming. It hurts, it confuses, but it clears the path. The paradox of instant distance whispers, not all journeys take time. Some happen in the heart at the speed of truth, and once they do, nothing is ever truly close in the same way again. A mirror is supposed to show you the truth. Your face, your posture, the arrangement of your features, as they are reversed, perhaps, but accurate. You rely on it to tell you what's there. But what happens when the reflection lies? What if it doesn't just distort, but contradicts? What if it reflects something that can't exist? This is the paradox of the impossible reflection, where what you see in the mirror is not just unfamiliar, but fundamentally false, and yet it's still you. It's the version of yourself you fear, you deny, or you don't recognize, because it only exists in the mirror, not physically, psychologically, existentially sometimes. This reflection shows you something you didn't know you were becoming, or something you thought you had buried. It's the moment you catch your own eyes and feel like a stranger is staring back. You smile, but it doesn't look sincere. You pose, but you don't see confidence, only performance. You adjust your hair, your clothes, but what unsettles you isn't your style, it's your presence, or the absence of it. The impossible reflection reveals a gap between self-image and self-truth. Not a physical illusion, but an existential one. You've crafted a version of yourself through choices, routines, titles, appearances. But the mirror doesn't just reflect those surface traits. Sometimes it echoes something deeper. And when it does, you realize the image doesn't align. In psychology, this paradox appears as dissociation, a disconnect between how we feel inside and how we appear outside. People with trauma, anxiety, or deep self-doubt often experience a jarring dissonance. This is my body, but it doesn't feel like me. This is my voice, but it sounds foreign. This is my smile, but I don't know who it belongs to. We all assume that the self is consistent, that the person inside and the person outside are aligned. But the mirror proves otherwise. And this isn't just a psychological issue, it's philosophical. Who is the real you? The one you feel like inside, the one others perceive, the one that appears in photographs, in mirrors, in memories. The impossible reflection asks, what if all of them are you and none of them are? It's not just about insecurity. It's about identity fragmentation. You might be a different self in every room you enter. And when you look in the mirror, you don't see a unified person. You see the conflict, the contradiction, the impossibility of summing yourself up in a single image. This paradox also plays out socially, online. Personas, curated feeds, avatars, selfies, filtered performances. You see yourself reflected back through likes, comments, projections, but none of it feels like you. Yet the world reacts to this version, as if it were the real one. So the impossible reflection grows stronger, more real than you, and you begin to feel invisible inside your own life. So how do we live with this paradox? We stop expecting the mirror to validate us. We stop waiting for the reflection to feel right. We stop using external images to confirm internal truths, and instead, we begin the quiet, honest work of witnessing ourselves not as a single identity, but as a collage, a shifting, living paradox of contradictions. Ask yourself, when do I feel most like myself? When do I feel most like a stranger to myself? What parts of me show up only in reflection, and what parts never appear at all? The impossible reflection isn't a glitch. It's a signal that the self isn't static, that truth doesn't always wear a consistent face. Sometimes, to find yourself, you must look away from the mirror and into your patterns, your choices, your longings, because that's where the real image forms, not in glass, but in becoming. So the next time the mirror disturbs you, or the selfie feels hollow, or the eyes staring back seem wrong, don't panic. You haven't lost yourself. You've simply met a version of you that you haven't made peace with yet, and that meeting, that discomfort, might be the first step to seeing clearly. Energy is meant to move. It sparks, flows, combusts. It drives engines, fuels thoughts, ignites action. When something is energized, it's alive, visible, kinetic, undeniable. But what happens when energy doesn't move? Not because it's gone, but because it sleeps. This is the paradox of sleeping energy. A force that is present but motionless, vibrant but still capable of transforming everything. Yet choosing silence, it's a strange kind of potential. You can feel it in a room before a storm, in the seconds before a dancer leaps, in the pause between inhale and exhale, the held breath of the universe. Energy doesn't disappear. We know this from physics. It only changes forms. But it can be stored, delayed, tucked away in matter, waiting. This paradox reflects not just the mechanics of nature, but something deeply human. You felt it, haven't you? That tension beneath your skin of something you could be doing, saying, changing, becoming, but haven't yet. You're not lazy, you're not empty, you're charged, just asleep. We call it procrastination, burnout, resistance, but it's more nuanced. It's that strange state where you're not acting yet, the potential is overwhelming. It's the book you haven't written, the life you haven't lived, the emotion you haven't expressed. The paradox is this: the more energy you store, the heavier it feels. You'd think resting would be peaceful, but sometimes rest becomes weight, because deep down, something inside you is glowing, unspent, unspoken, untouched. In the natural world, this shows up in dormant volcanoes, still. Mountains, silent for centuries, yet holding unimaginable force beneath their crusts. Not dead, just waiting. Or seeds in dry earth, carrying entire forests inside, but needing the right season to awaken. So too, in our inner worlds, ideas can sleep, desires can sleep, power can sleep, sometimes for years, and this can be confusing, because you may wonder, if I have so much potential, why am I stuck? Why don't I feel alive? The answer may be, you are not stuck. You are sleeping energy, and that changes everything. Because sleeping energy isn't failure, it's preparation. The trick is learning to distinguish sleep from death. Not everything that is still is gone. Not everything that is quiet is empty. We often panic in the stillness. We assume something is wrong. We chase stimulation, productivity, proof. But the paradox invites you to trust the stillness, to recognize the hum beneath your own skin, to feel the coiled spring of your becoming. There's wisdom in not rushing. Some energies need time to mature. Some truths need space to germinate. Some fires burn too brightly to be lit too soon. Ask yourself, what is asleep in me right now? What am I postponing, not out of fear, but because some part of me knows it's not time? What force within me is holding its breath? And when that moment comes, when your sleeping energy wakes, it may feel sudden. You'll speak the words you've swallowed for years. You'll take the leap you've rehearsed in dreams. You'll become what you've always been but hadn't yet expressed. And those around you will call it a miracle, or a breakthrough, or a transformation. But you'll know it was always there, just sleeping. Sleeping energy is not a void. It's a promise. It asks for patience, for trust, for the quiet courage to wait without self-hate. Because when it wakes, when it finally stirs, it won't just change your life. It will remind you that stillness was never the absence of power. It was the womb of it. What is a shape without space? Imagine a circle, but there's no surface to draw it on. Picture a cube, but it occupies no volume. Visualize form edges, boundaries, curves, but floating in a void so complete that there's nothing to contain it, define it, or surround it. This is the paradox of shape without space, a form that exists, but has nowhere to be. At first glance, it feels absurd. Isn't space the very condition for anything to have shape? A line needs length. A figure needs dimensions. A body needs room. But this paradox asks us to rethink what existence means. Can something have structure, definition, or identity without context to hold it? Can something be and yet have nowhere to be? In mathematics, abstract shapes exist outside of physical space. They can be described by equations, imagined in thought, but never built, never touched, never placed. They are real, but not spatially real. This is the realm of imaginary geometry, of higher dimensions, where objects like hypercubes or Klein bottles twist logic forms that suggest edges, but refuse to obey the laws of space as we know it. But this paradox is not limited to math. It's also psychological, philosophical, personal. Consider identity. What happens when you've formed yourself, your beliefs, values, emotions, but can't find a place in the world to live them out? You become a shape without space. Your edges are real, but the world offers no room for them. You know who you are, but society doesn't accommodate it. Your truth is sharp and vivid, but there's nowhere to fully speak it, share it, embody it. It's like holding a melody, but no one's listening, or having a story, but no language to tell it. This is the experience of many people throughout history, the visionary misunderstood, the child in a household that doesn't see them, the thinker in a culture that values obedience, the soul who dreams in color but lives in a monochrome world. They are not broken, they are shaped, but without space. The pain of this paradox is deep, because it tricks you into thinking that maybe the shape is the problem. Maybe you should soften the edges, or shrink the volume, or twist yourself into something flatter. But the paradox teaches something else. Sometimes it's not the shape that's wrong, it's the absence of space. So how do we live with this? First, by recognizing when this paradox is active in our lives. Ask yourself, Where in my life do I feel fully formed but unseen? Where do I have ideas, passions, or truths, but no container to hold them? Where do I feel like a puzzle piece with no puzzle? Then comes the second truth. Sometimes you must carve out your own space, not wait for the world to invite you, not shrink yourself to fit, but expand reality to include you. The artist creates the gallery, the misfit creates the tribe, the visionary builds the new language, the wounded builds the altar from broken stones. You are the shape. Now become the space, and here's the final, humbling twist. Sometimes your space won't arrive in this lifetime. Sometimes your shape will echo into the future, waiting for the world to catch up, like Van Gogh's brushstrokes, like forgotten manuscripts discovered centuries later, like a seed held in frozen earth waiting for climate change, for kindness, for a crack in history. Shape without space is not a flaw. It is a sign you are ahead of your time, or out of place, or simply born in a reality that doesn't yet match your form, but the form is still real. It is still sacred, even if no one sees it. Even if you never find the stage, it exists, and sometimes that's enough to know you were formed. To know your curves, your structure, your presence, they mean something. Even in the dark, even in silence, even in space, that hasn't yet arrived, because maybe the paradox isn't a curse, but a prophecy, a reminder that the space will come, maybe not today, but eventually, and when it does, your shape will finally fit, not because it changed, but because the world did. What if everything you believed about reality, about motion, time, matter, energy, even your own mind, was only half the truth? Across these 25 paradoxes, we've touched the edge of something deeper, not chaos, but a strange kind of order that refuses to obey our expectations, falling upward, stillness faster than speed, a flame that doesn't burn, a shape that has no space. These aren't just riddles for the mind. They are mirrors. They reveal the silent contradictions woven into our lives, where feeling full can feel empty and silence can echo louder than sound. The universe, it seems, was never built on logic alone. It pulses with tensions, gaps, loops, reversals. It folds in on itself and dares you to let go of certainty. So let this video be your permission to not have all the answers, to hold paradox without fear, to find beauty not in clarity, but in the trembling edge between opposites, because maybe life doesn't need to resolve. Maybe it just needs to be witnessed as it flips, flickers, breaks, reforms and reminds you. The laws of nature were never the end of the story. They were just the beginning of the question.